So we want to move on to our next session, which is basically looking at setting the stage. What is the data telling us? And to moderate this session will be Shukri Gesod, a GBV expert with UNHCR Regional Bureau for East and Horn of Africa and Great Lakes region. So welcome, Shukri. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. I just wanted to say thank you so much for this opportunity, as we've now heard so much about data and the importance of data in terms of centralizing the problem and finding solutions when it comes to GBV prevention and across all our work in crisis settings. As it's an honor for me to facilitate this session in setting up the stage by specifically looking at what the data is telling us. We have two great panelists today, which I will get into shortly, who have some data for us, so we can start diving into that. So as mentioned by George, my name is Shukri Gesod, and I'm the GBV officer here with UNHCR Regional Bureau for the East and Horn of Africa and Great Lakes, but also a member of the intersectionality pillar at the regional GBV AOR working group. Sexual violence against male child and adolescent boys in crisis setting remains poorly understood, addressed, lost in the term under children or youth, which often is shorthanded for girls, confined to a footnote at best, with sentences such as especially boys, or reported under the rubric of torture. Therefore, we must begin with a caveat that male child and adolescent boys experience distinct vulnerability and at risk of sexual violence, and their needs by large have not been given adequate attention in our humanitarian programming to ensure equal protection and provision of services for all affected by sexual violence. Specifically, they remain at risk and victims of patriarchy and hypermasculinity when it comes to conflict settings, displacement settings, and other forms of crisis settings that we respond to. To discuss the issue further with me today is Francesco Cecon, who's the head of the Global Boys Initiative at ECPAT International, and Peter Kisaakye, who is a fellow with the Population Council and was at the helm of the research that was currently done in Uganda on the first ever violence against children and youth survey in refugee settlements under the Baobab Research Program Consortium. Yeah, sorry? Sorry, we have a noise coming through. If you can please mute yourself. So I would like to first start by inviting our first panelist, Francesco. Francesco Cecon, how distinct is the experience of sexual violence for boys, and what are the distinct barriers that you can tell us more on in terms of the experience when it comes to reporting around sexual violence, as well as accessing critical services that they need? Francesco?
Thank you so much, Shukri, and thank you everyone for having ECPAT International on this very important symposium. We're very excited to be here and talk about ways to protect boys from sexual violence and exploitation. I'm just gonna very quickly introduce the work we do at the Global Boys Initiative, and then perhaps set the stage answering Shukri's question and providing some qualitative data on the specific challenges that boys face when it comes to issues of sexual violence. So if we could move to the next slide, please. Thank you. Just quickly, for those of you who don't know us, ECPAT International is a global network of organizations working to end specifically sexual exploitation and abuse of children in all of its forms. And we have members in 104 countries in all regions of the world. And ECPAT International developed what we call the Global Boys Initiative, that it's an initiative to precisely shed light and develop solutions for the protection on the sexual exploitation and abuse of boys, which has been said again by colleagues earlier. It's a very understudied and under-researched and unaddressed issue in the child protection sector. So just before I talk about the qualitative data we gathered, I just wanted to give you an idea as well of how we gather this data and evidence. And of course, I will be more than happy to share all the links and all the research that we have that is, of course, available on our website. So we did a first global literature review on the issue of sexual exploitation of boys, but also 10 country-specific reports through Asia, the Americas, Africa, and Europe, in which we were able to dig deeper into the questions of sexual abuse and exploitation of boys in its different manifestations, and understand the challenges and barriers that boys specifically face. And part of the methodology of this research included also consultations with boy survivors themselves. We also extracted data on boys from Disrupting Harm, which is a research project that was conducted in 13 countries in Africa and Asia, specifically on online sexual abuse and exploitation, seen at how in some occasions in some countries boys were as affected as girls. We conducted a global mapping of service providers and organizations who have experience in working with boy survivors, and we conducted a series of case studies, 8 available so far, again across different countries and regions, to document and learn from promising practices of services that have been carried out with boy survivors, to understand how they had to adjust the way they work, to be able to deconstruct gender norms, ideas of masculinity, and provide protection services and support that was sensitive to the trajectories of boys. So from all the data and information that we gathered through research and practice, what was interesting is that in spite of the cultural, economic, and different backgrounds on different countries, the key issues when it comes to the sexual abuse and exploitation of boys are kind of similar. So there are common learnings that we could see throughout all research across all societies, and that can be resumed in this quick slide, with the first one being gender norms. It's been mentioned already, but gender norms affect the perception that we all have of the vulnerability of boys when it comes specifically to issues of sexual violence. And I'll go deeper into all of these points later. Another key point, a key learning that we saw through research, was the fact that boys do face what we call unique and complex challenges when it comes to sexual violence, both in terms of being perceived as victims, but also in terms of being able to seek and access support. And finally, the third one that concerns us all as a child protection community is that frontline workers, including humanitarian workers, struggle in providing support to boys. And we're not necessarily equipped or skilled enough to know how to work with the specific trajectories of boys when it comes to issues of sexual violence. And again, I'll go into further detail of this in a second. So these key learnings, as you can imagine, of course, they are all interconnected to one another, and they all lead to the challenges and obstacles that boys face to be able to access protection services. So first of all, gender norms. Boys themselves, from our research, show that they internalize beliefs and ideas of masculinity that prevent them from seeking out help and seeking support. We all know the expressions, boys don't cry, boys are not weak, boys are not supposed to share emotions and feelings. And that, of course, is a gender bias that we all have, but boys themselves, from a very young age, have internalized. So it's very hard for a boy first to understand the situation in that sense, but also to be able to share and to seek out help. And that same bias is also integrated in the way that families and communities function. And even if a boy is able sometimes to look for help or ask or share, they might be dismissed, or they might not just be believed, and because they are not perceived as someone who can be vulnerable to sexual exploitation and abuse. Sometimes this bias of not seeing them as vulnerable can also lead to having boys less supervised, or having them in street situations, exposing them even more to issues, to risk of sexual violence. And even when they are believed, or even when they are able to share, sometimes, especially on issues of sexual exploitation, boys might be seen as participatory actors, especially when it comes to adolescent boys, in which we might see, because boys want to explore sexually, we might see them as, you know, you wanted this, you looked for this is normal for a boy. So you see there are already several layers just at this point to be able to have a report of a case of sexual violence against a boy. And then again, as I said, everything is interconnected, but even when boys or families or communities are able to report and make sure that services, they go and access services, many times support workers, frontline workers, and it's not because it's their fault, but they're not equipped to understand boys' reaction and recognize boys' emotions, trajectories, and then tailor the support that they provide. And what we saw from research was, again, that the gender bias that we have is so baked in also in the way that frontline workers work. So we might think that a boy might have another issue, or might have an issue with violence, an issue with substance or drug abuse, a mental health concern, but not necessarily about sexual violence. So many boys go undetected by the child protection system as well. And then, you know, and this is we saw, especially working with practitioners, it's very hard to have the necessary skill set to be able to understand boys' reaction, which sometimes can be male expected behaviors such as violence, aggressiveness, or isolation, to be able to deal with that with calm, and also to be able to construct trust and rapport with boys. And this is, again, no one's fault, but because for so long, as someone mentioned before, we've not been used to have training and resources on how to adapt services to boys. So boys end up, like maybe mentioned, in one line, and that is reflected in the way that frontline workers, case management workers, are not necessarily able to know how to deal with all of this, but also how to deal with boys in a way that constructs trust and takes away perceived ideas of masculinity. And finally, the other issue is, again, training content is not exclusive of boy-specific experiences, and there is no guidance on this. And this is finally, this bias is also reflected in our procedures, in our protocols on how to do case management sometimes. So we still have a gap there in the way that we function as child protection actors in knowing what to do in the case we have as boy survivors of sexual violence or sexual exploitation. Who do we refer them to? Who's responsible for this boy? But also, what is the kind of approach that we need to take to make sure that the whole case management system remains safe and appropriate? We can move to the next slide. Perfect. Here, I just wanted to showcase these key points and key learnings that I just mentioned through the voices of boy survivors that we consulted directly. So when we talk about systematic gaps, I think it was quite telling that one of the boys we consulted shared, I don't know why they call it national, talking about the child protection system, if they only support girls. And here I wanted to pick up on the question of language that Shukri mentioned. If we have services that are just specifically for women and girls, boys might be reluctant to go seek out for help there. Not because they might not receive the help, but because, again, of the idea of masculinity that they have, they do not perhaps want to be identified with a service that is only for women and girls, so they do not feel that that is the place where they can look for help. The second one on gender norms, I think it's telling that boys internalize gender norms so from a very young age, to the point that they are not able to understand what is that they can be themselves victim of sexual violence. And one of the boys shared, I didn't know back then that the situation of abuse was something over the line. I thought it was just uncomfortable for me. And then again, it's quite telling to tell you that boys might even struggle to think they can be victims of sexual violence. And this bias is reflected with boys, with families, with communities, and with us as well. And on the question of unique challenges that the boys face, again, because help-seeking behaviors are not encouraged, and because sharing is not encouraged for boys, boys might look for help in different ways that are not necessarily the most straightforward ones. And one of the boys told us, I went to teachers, stating that I had cancer or fatal illnesses every week. No one asked what was going on with me, and I just wanted someone to ask if everything was all right. So again, because of the questions of shame, because of the questions of boys don't cry, because we like boys do not necessarily are able to say what happened to them and look for help straightforwardly. They might look for other ways. But again, frontline workers, but all actors that interact with children might not necessarily think that boys are concerned by this issue. And this is reflected again by the way that support workers do conduct their work. And one last survivor quote, a boy said, "I became silent and I started missing class and other activities that once I used to enjoy. No one noticed anything except for one teacher after months." So that tells you a lot as well in terms of the timing, and that tells you as well that in cases of sexual violence against boys who are still not able to provide a quick response to also the most urgent needs. So we started as well from these research gaps that we acknowledged and this information that we gathered through extensive research. We also started to look at solutions. And as I said, we conducted 8 case studies from different countries, as you can see here on the map. So in Latin America, in Africa, in the MENA region, in Europe and East and South Asia, to work with organizations that do have experience in providing protection, case management, and support to boys. And for us, it was important to collect these promising practices to see what kind of practices are encouraging boys to seek out help, but also how service providers had to adjust the way they were working to be able to support boys. And yes, I'm conscious of time.
You have 5 minutes.
5 minutes. I'll be fast, I promise. Thank you. And again, I think what was interesting to see here is that as per research, very different countries, very different regions, but very similar approaches that were implemented. And if we can go into the next slide, I'll present them very quickly. So I tried, as of course, this is very extensive and I'm happy to share the case studies, but you will see that there are common learnings as well on the way that services had to adjust to be able to work. And I hope it gives you some ideas for the rest of the discussions as well today. So all service providers identified that they had to do a lot of exercise to deconstruct the pressure that was put on boys to comply with the idea of masculinity. So providing safe spaces, that doesn't mean to provide a physical safe space only, but provide a space to work with boys in which they didn't need to be, classically strong or stoic as we expect boys to be as per gender norms. Safety also becomes to questions of psychological and emotional safety. So in enabling spaces where confidentiality was important, especially in some contexts, and where trust, rapport, and saying sentences like "I believe you" were more even important with boys, because boys are so used to get dismissed when they report cases of sexual violence because of everything we discussed before. And finally, what we found that was useful through the series of case studies was the importance of, to the extent possible, conduct some, to some level, group activities with boys, with group survivors or peer support system with adolescent boys specifically, because that kind of reduced the sense of stigma and isolation, to show boys that other boys went through the same issue, helped them, and seemed promising as a practice. So I know I'm over time probably, so I'm going to stop here, but I'm happy to answer any questions throughout the day as well. And I thank you very much for listening.
Thank you so much, Francesco, for that and for giving us this sobering, I would say, perspective and voices. I think for all of us as protection actors, hearing the voices from the adolescent boys and how we are understanding issues around age and the intersection between age and power differentials within the construction and deconstruction of masculinity, identity, and manhood and boyhood plays a lot in terms of this invisibility of the vulnerabilities of boys and how we program and the biases we have. So thank you so much for that. And now next, we will move to our next presentation coming from Peter Kisaakye. Peter, now that building on from this presentation, I will invite you to now help us think through around specifically from your data, how is the cycle of violence against male child and adolescent boys manifesting specifically in refugee settings? And what program recommendations do you have for us for course correction to ensure that we are protecting and responding to all and have better understanding of how these vulnerabilities are manifesting and how to better tailor our programs for them? Peter, over to you.
Thank you very much, Shukri. Good morning, everyone. I just want to say that it's an honor to present at this very important meeting, but also just to say that this is collaborative work. It involves so many partners, so many colleagues, and yes, so I just wanted to say that. The previous speakers have alluded to the fact that, we don't have so much data, and this is very timely because this is the very first VAX survey that has been conducted in a refugee setting. So it's sort of like, illuminates, what we don't know, because see, if we don't have data, then we can't come up with actionable programs. We can't get to know what the problem is. We can't find solutions. And I think this is very important. So let's talk about, a little bit about, how distinct, sexual violence is among boys, but also talk about a little bit about access to safe spaces. So the evidence gap is that, a few studies, I think previous slide, a few studies are focused on the experience of violence among boys. I think this is, largely speaks to what the previous speakers have said, that regarding lack of data, so if we don't have data, then we can't even come up with solutions. We can't get to know what the problem is. And so, quite a number of, a few studies, again, have tried to explore sexual violence among boys. Again, boys seem to be a neglected, category of people. And because of that, it becomes very difficult really to come up with programming. Next slide, please. Yes, so the study objectives for this, we wanted to examine the experience of sexual violence among boys in refugee settings in Uganda. But through this, then we'll get to know, the extent of sexual violence among boys. We'll also get to know those that reported, those that meted out violence against their colleagues. But we'll also talk about where sexual violence occurs most, and also talk about the disclosure and help-seeking behaviors. So I just wanted to show you the context of, the refugee context in Uganda. So in total, we have 13 refugee settlements, and this study was conducted in all refugee settlements. We try and show, the country of origins. Obviously, when you see Adjumani and Bidibidi and Parabek and Paulinya and Rhino and Invepi, the biggest bulk of these refugees, they come from South Sudan. Next slide, please. So, again, just to show you, the process that we went through before going to the field. So we had this intensive, training of the field team. Next slide, please. So the study design, this was a cross-sectional study. It was conducted in 13 refugee settlements. We employed the split sample. In total, we went to 56 zones, sampled across all settlements. And for the males, there are only 28 zones. And in total, about 927 interviews were completed for the male interviews. Next slide, please. Again, just to show you, the training. So I just want to show you the summary of the findings before I get into the details. One of the most important takeaway message is that boys experience sexual violence early and often. The other one we got from the data is that friends are the most common reported people who meted out sexual violence for young respondents. Because we analyzed this data in two age categories, 13 to 17, the young adolescents, and the older adolescents, 18 to 24. Safe places outside the home are rare for boys. That's something that we took from the data. But also, boy survivors of sexual violence rarely seek help. Okay. Next slide, please. The characteristics of the respondents, male respondents, we noted that, most were aged 18 to 24 years, slightly more than half, 51.5%. Most had completed or attended secondary education. We're talking about 38.6%. Majority of them were from South Sudan. Of course, as you say, the context, talking about, more or less 70%. and only 10.4% reported to have ever had sex before the age of 16, and 16.9% reported to have been married or lived with someone. Yeah. Next slide, please. So yeah, again, so just to show you the experience of sexual violence, to buttress the point said that it happens very early and often. When you look at these age groups, the different age groups, 18, 25, 13, 17, what we notice is that it's more prevalent among older adolescents compared to young adolescents. Next slide, please. Again, those who reported to have meted out sexual violence are largely those close to the boys. So we're talking about a friend. More than half, 58%, among 13, 17. But when it comes to 18, 24, okay, it was the current or previous pattern. About 28, about 30%, a third of them. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. Yeah, okay. Yeah, sexual violence among boys, again, noted like most locales and spaces outside home. Again, when you look at, for example, outside home, very high for both age groups, 18-24, talking about 56.7%, and about 7 in every 10, around 13-17. Yeah. Next slide, please. Boy survivors of sexual violence rarely seek help, although many know where to get help. Again, you're talking about, on average, again, 7 out of every 10. And this cuts across between those 18-24 and those 13-17. Next slide, please. So, what are the implications for programming? From the results, we can conclude that there is need for strengthening child protection programs. Okay? But also, child protection programs can consider the intersectionality of age-appropriate programming of survivors in terms of providing services. So, intersectionality, we're looking at different categories of these males. The boys, not just being refugees, but they're boys, they're young, they're living in these environments, these are their socioeconomic statuses and all that. Yes, the other thing that we want to talk about is about community-based innovative strategies that are needed to engage caregivers and those that interact with boys in their daily lives. So we give examples of peers and friends who actually were reported to be, the most perpetrators of violence. Thank you very much, Shukri, and thanks very much for listening to me.
Thank you so much, Peter. You do have some few more minutes. So do you have any other reflection that might not have been noted, for example, in your presentation that you would like to share with us, specifically given the fact that, the data that you have collected, I mean, we're talking about majority of the boys specifically saying that they're not safe outside the home. I mean, can you elaborate a little bit more onto that? Where is outside? Are we talking about the communal spaces, the public spaces? Where is it? Did you get anything else? I know this is still key findings, but do you have anything from the research that could shed a little bit of light in terms of the safety issue and spaces?
Yeah, absolutely. So when we say that outside home, obviously, this would include so many spaces. I mean, so we're talking about being in a communal area, being at school, being, in the village, in the market. So it can include, so many. It can also include outside of the river. So it can include so many spaces when we say outside of the home. But also, from the results, it was very evident that, even though these boys may know where to get help, for some reason, they're not willing to go and get help. So I think then we need to unpack what are some of these reasons. There could be that maybe oftentimes when we talk about sexual violence, oftentimes, our minds quickly go to violence against girls. And so I think this could be a neglected, subcategory or subpopulation that we think we need to really emphasize the need to really seek help. We need to really, bring them on board as well, and emphasize the fact that, boys also matter and they also experience these forms of violence. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that. I think it's so important that we've been able to at least have one study, and the fact that you guys through this study managed to talk to 927 boys in regards to actually trying to collect some, some of their experiences and voices. And I think the fact that we've been mentioning since the morning in relation to the lack of data and the importance of data in terms of really us understanding the problem and how we respond to the issue, specifically given the fact that what we are saying is the protection of children, and as much as possible, not necessarily sticking with just that label, because as we've noted, even in Francesco's presentation, language does matter. So children sometimes can be a shorthand for something else. So really taking a very strong gender analysis perspective when it comes to understanding vulnerability and unpacking of masculinity and how it affects younger boys or male child and adolescent boys for that matter. So thank you so much for this. And just to allow us to really interact with the presentations and with our panelists who have done the qualitative and quantitative study in regards to this issue, to try to help and shed some light into the problem by giving it some data, by far not the kind of data we need, and we still need more energy redirected to this matter to really help us collect data. But to help us engage in this discourse a little bit further, I will open the floor for the next 15 minutes for Q&A. However, I will kindly ask the colleagues to really use the raising hand function. So I will then be able to pick and call out for participants to come in and ask question either to Francesco or Peter. And second to that, if you have any comment in regards to the presentation and not necessarily a specific question, I will kindly ask you to use the chat box to put that question or comment, so we really use the floor for specific questions. Thank you. So any reaction, anyone would like to come forth who has a question for either Francesco or Peter? Has anybody raised their hands? I can't seem to see any hand on my screen.
I saw there were some hands raised.
Okay, I can't seem to see any hand raised on my side, Christine. Maybe perhaps you can just call out the first person as I figure out why.
Shukri, we do also have some questions in the chat box. You could direct to the speakers.
Okay. I'm not seeing any questions so far in the chat box. Camilla, can we start with the ones who are raising hands as I go through the chat box, and then I will, so we don't waste time.
I also don't see any raised hands. Oh, now I do. Mary Luce has raised her hand. So maybe if we start with Mary Luce.
If you can please take the floor.
Yes, thank you very much. My name is Mary Luce Fioniada. I work for the Swiss Agency for Development and Cooperation. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you. Please go ahead.
Okay, fine. As an advisor for protection and migration for Sub-Saharan Africa Division. So thank you very much for organizing this symposium. I would like to ask a question to Peter, because he said at the end of his presentation that a solution is to develop innovative community-based approaches regarding sexual and gender-based violence on boys. And I would like to be very interested in getting more information about these innovative, concrete experience, concrete illustrations or actions regarding these community-based approaches, because within SDC, we also think that community-based approaches are very important to involve people in prevention and also healing processes. And we have some programs in either in Great Lakes or in the East Africa region. So I would be very interested in getting some further and concrete information about this innovative community-based approach he was talking about. Thank you very much.
Francesco?
Peter, mainly.
Can I answer now, Shukri?
Yes, please go ahead.
Yeah, so thank you very much for that wonderful question. So we're talking about, ideas, that sort of like speak to engaging caregivers that mostly interact with these boys. But also not forgetting, because remember they said that it is actually the friends that mostly abuse them. So not forget, in addition to the caregivers, we should not forget, also their friends. We should not forget about their peers, but also to continuously engage other key partners, other key actors in the community, to bring them on board, talk about this sexual violence, but also enhance awareness, about all these availability of violence prevention and response services for boys. So we think that, one of them is to increase awareness, but also working with caregivers and not leaving behind these friends or peers because they're closer to them, but also to engage other, actors in the field and also in the community. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Peter, for that. I will also like to invite now Yvette Motesi, who has her hand up.
All right, thank you, Shukri, for hosting us. My name is Motesi Yvette from Uganda, and my question is, I would like to know how best, what is the approach you're trying to use to help these young boys who are survivors of sexual violation? Because in the first presentation, he spoke of friends and peers being the ones that are violating these boys often. But still, in my view, I'm thinking that there is no way you're going to come as a stranger and start speaking to this young boy or this man without him knowing anything about you. So I don't know how best are you going to approach these young boys, because if friends are the ones violating them and the peers, yet they are the people you are supposed to pass through the information so that it reaches them. Like you said, they lack data. I'm a bit confused. I would really want to know what approach you're planning to use in order to help them.
Thank you so much, Mutesi, for that question. I will actually like to welcome first maybe Francesco to respond to that, and then to Peter. Francesco?
Yes, thank you. And thank you, Yvette, for your question. I think it really depends on the context. From our research and from the work we did with civil society organizations, it's not all the time the peers or the friends. Sometimes, it's someone from the family or family at large, as we might call it, and also external people, sometimes people in school. So it's not always the friends, but what we saw in general as a practice that seemed to work is to be able to go towards the boys and not necessarily call them out in a group, or make sure that we stay to a situation in which there is confidentiality and there is respect of the boy's situation, so the boy are not necessarily identified as someone that has been a survivor of sexual violence and so on. So there is not solution yet, and I think the symposium comes timely in identifying together also what we can do moving forward in terms of programming and do it better. And I'm eager to hear from other experiences. But what we saw is that many times service providers used to take boys separately and understand what's going on in their lives, if they had anything to share, and then have private sessions with them and isolating them from the situations that were of concern, of risk by the boy identified themselves. Then if the situation doesn't come from friends necessarily, what we saw is that it was useful to have group activities that do not necessarily need to be structured around the situations of sexual violence, but can provide psychosocial support to boys who are in situations of distress. And I think, you know, it can create companionship, support, and so on. But I think they all require specific individual approaches, and the perpetrator and the case of the perpetrator. So if the boy's been abused by other friends or other children, it's a completely different approach that you might use compared to if a boy is exploited or abused in the family or in the community or in the school, for instance. So considering that it's an individual approach, I think what we saw that it was working, it was always like creating a safe space that is confidential in the approach you use when talking to the boy, when speaking to the boys, we're assisting the boy. I don't know if that addressed completely your question, but I think it's still an interesting area to explore. We don't have all the solutions yet.
Thank you so much, Francesco, for that. In the interest of time, I will kindly move us to the next question, and then we can, you know, we can sort of like pick this up, because I think that the next session is going to dive into the barriers to access to services, and I think this is where we can, you know, we can have that issue can be discussed a little bit further, and then we will start, as the session continue, we'll be unpacking this. So I would like to invite Marion, who has raised her hand as well, to the floor for their question.
Yes, thank you very much for the wonderful analysis and presentation. My name is from Plan International South Sudan, working as a child protection and emergency specialist. I have few questions, and they are interconnected. Looking at the age appropriateness of interventions, I'm wondering whether there was difference between issues raised by younger boys and adolescents. And the other component is some of the strategies that were recommended of working with the younger boys. For example, when you're working with the children, some might not be able to verbalize the issues. So that requires some kind of additional strategies. And then lastly, I wanted to hear whether girls and women were equally consulted. As much as we are focusing on boys, they might not also open up, but maybe the sisters or the mothers can be able to speak on their behalf. Thank you, and over.
Thank you so much for that. Peter,
Yes.
would you like to respond to that, please?
Yes, thank you very much. Yeah, I'll start with the question in the chat. Someone asked about, programs that, we can always come up with to create awareness. Yes, even before, the abuse happens. And I just wanted to say that, we can talk about, the availability of psychosocial support and counselors and all that. The idea is to tell them, these are the services. This is where you can get the services to prevent violence, because sometimes if they don't know where these services are, where to seek help, then violence is going to occur. So by just telling them, we have these services, we can use this to prevent violence, these are the psychosocial support services we have, the counselors and all that, I think we can go a long way in preventing violence. Now, the question about differences in the age groups, yes, quite a number of differences. So for example, when we talk about experience of sexual violence, we discovered that, it was prevalent among older adolescents than young adolescents, probably because maybe someone would say they've lived longer compared to the young adolescents. But also, when you talk about, perpetrators, in quotes, because I shouldn't be using that word, I think, you discover that for the younger ones, they talked about the friends, okay? But for the older ones, they talked about the previous or current partner, okay? So speaking about, I think, being more sexually active among older adolescents than young adolescents. So yes, I think there were quite a number of differences, but of course, these differences were not very significant when it came to, for example, location of where the most incident of sexual violence occurs, when it came to about disclosure and health service seeking behaviors. So what we can note, the conclusion we can think, we can come up with is that, generally, okay, so safe places, are not there, okay, for these boys outside home. But also the take-home message that we have generally, irrespective of the age group, is that yeah, there's a very poor service-seeking behavior among these boys. And I think that's the take-home messages. Yeah. The other question was about how we're able to reach these boys in IDP camps. It seems to be very difficult. Yeah, we work with so many partners. So there are, entry points, yes, that you go through to reach these boys in the settlements. So for the case of Uganda, we work collaboratively with the Office of the Prime Minister, UNHCR, but also other actors in the refugee settlements that are gatekeepers who, gave us entry to go and reach these boys. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Peter, for that. We will also take one. I will ask kindly Doreen to wait. We are running out of time, and we have a question. I will start at the top. We have a question around how does gender norms intersect with toxic masculinity and colonization, especially for boys. I would like to invite Francesco again onto discussion of this through the research and the literature review that you guys have done. Was this an element in which you were factoring it in regards to looking at how these two interplay when it comes to the experiences of boys when it comes to sexual violence and exploitation?
Thank you for that question. I'll try to address the first part on toxic masculinity. That is the main issue, the root cause of the issue on so many levels, in which boys are victims of the patriarchy as well in that way. So boys internalize, as seen before, the idea of what it means to be a boy and a future man from a very early age, and that prevents boys from having help-seeking behaviors, sharing emotions, showing any kind of what traditionally we consider weakness in that sense. And that prevents not only from seeking help, but it also makes them feel guilty and shameful about the situation that happened. And finally, the last and probably less unseen consequence is the fact that they might share what is going on in their life, the situation of abuse or sexual abuse and sexual exploitation and so on, through what we call male expected behaviors. So that hypermasculinity or toxic masculinity, so that normally are aggression, violence, and so on. And that fuels a cycle of violence within communities. So we saw that most of the boys that go undetected by child protection actor and child protection systems, it's because of that. And sometimes they end up in situations of street violence, they end up in situations of conflict with the law, or become themselves sometimes perpetrators of violence against others, including sexual and gender-based violence against girls. So it's really important to consider that the whole issue of masculinity has so many collateral effects in the capacity of boys being able to seek out help, access help, but also in the way they're going to demonstrate their emotions, because we have taught them that they can have no other emotions than aggressiveness, violence, and strength, if we can call it like that. So that's absolutely an issue. And that's why I said it also when it comes to practice and approaches in work with boys, what service providers told us is that they learned how to deconstruct the pressure that boys felt to comply with the idea of what it means to be a man. So, to reinforce and strengthen language around safety, confidentiality, but also to say it's okay to cry, it's okay to share emotions, it's okay to ask for help. That makes you strong, that doesn't make you weak. So understanding those dynamics and the hypermasculinization, it's important for service providers as well. And I'm going to be short because I know we don't have much time, but I think one interesting point that came out is that because boys, and especially adolescent boys, might express a cry for help or a look for help through aggressive behavior sometimes, that can also be quite intimidating for the social workforce that is not necessarily trained on how to deal with that. And that takes a big emotional toll on frontline workers as well. And this is something that we should not forget. So this is why it's so crucial to also train service providers, frontline workers on how to deal with those male expected behaviors that come from an idea of masculinity, to don't feel intimidated by that, but have the tools to calm boys down and know how to communicate and build trust with them without the pressure of fitting into what it means to be a man.
Thank you so much, Francesco, and thank you so much, Peter. I know we have a lot of more questions, both in terms in the chat, but also hands raised. I will sincerely apologize that we couldn't reach all of you, given timing, and I don't want to press a little bit further because we've already eaten out 2 minutes from this. However, we do have the rest of the day, and hopefully we will find time to continue the dialogue and the discussion and interaction with the presentation as we continue the day. Thank you again, and I would like to take this opportunity to hand over back to George for the next session. Have a good morning.